Hello, everyone. I'm excited to bring you Adam Wasch. Adam is a franchise attorney. He works with franchisors and franchisees representing both emerging and mature brands. You can find him on Twitter. He is the franchise attorney. So welcome to the show, Adam.
Thank you very much for having me, Brian.
So of all the different lines of law you could practice, why franchising?
So, I enjoy representing folks that are happy. I try to avoid conflict in my life as best I can, and in franchising, what I've found is the entrepreneurial spirit, the growth mindset. Those are things that I enjoy as an entrepreneur myself, and helping people get into businesses they like, and obviously figure out the due diligence behind some of these brands that are coming online to make smart investments. So that's my passion. I've been doing it for over a decade now, representing both franchisees, franchisors, and investors looking to get into the industry.
Okay. So have you always been in franchising as an attorney?
I started out at a typical big firm where I did a lot of defense litigation, representing big companies, learned the ins and outs of how to be a lawyer, did a lot of commercial disputes, trademark issues, not necessarily for franchise companies. It came up once in a while, but at the big firms, unless you're really specializing in franchising, most of them don't really touch it. I got my start as a small firm attorney, boutique, doing franchise work in 2014. My dad was an in-house counsel for a few brands in the 90s, and had been interested in partnering up with his son. So I kind of brought the energy to his solo practice, and learned the ins and outs of the industry, and started going to the ABA Franchise Forum in 2014, and really educated myself and immersed myself into the franchise industry, where and that's where it started. Awesome.
So first, I'm going to talk about working with prospective franchisees first, and then maybe we'll talk about kind of the franchisors, because I think it's more relevant. So you get a call or a DM from someone on Twitter, and they say, "Hey, Adam, I'm looking to buy this franchise, and can you help me look through the FDD?" So kind of walk me through, what does that process look like? What are the things that you're looking for? And then maybe we can get into some stories without naming any names of some red flags and some other stuff. So I'm searching, you see some crazy shit. So what does that look like? You get the DM or you get the message, what's your kind of process? What are the things you're starting to do?
Sure. So being in the industry, talking to a lot of people, there are a lot of brands that I'm familiar with on the franchisee side. But, I start basically the same way, with talking to the client about their background, what their interests are, what, most folks that I'm dealing with are either young entrepreneurs looking for businesses, or they're corporate America guys who've been in a W-2 for a long time, and now they're looking for that second stage of their life, and they're looking to franchising to accomplish that. So I get to know the client. I like to really understand their motivations, so that helps me in looking at the FDD and helping them with what additional due diligence might be needed. So I'll do go through the FDD to start, and certainly highlight a few issues. I'll draft a memo actually for the client to have with key terms, negotiating points that I've been able to accomplish, and red flags. So that's the basics, and certainly if you have any questions on
I've got a few on that. So
I can go into the weeds on the FDD itself.
Yeah, we will. So you're talking to somebody about their skills, their goal, what they like. Has it ever happened where man, this brand's not for you based on what you told me? Does that ever happen?
And I say this to clients, I won't tell someone that they shouldn't pursue a franchise. There's
Yeah.
very few, categories of, let's say, like you need a contractor's license, right, to do a commercial services franchise, and that person doesn't have the license. That's something where I'd say, listen, like, I could continue with this due diligence.
But you're going to need to hire somebody, or
exactly.
Depends on the state too, right? Some it's like you can get it easily. Others, like, you need a journeyman. You got to pay him a bounty every month, and all the stuff.
Right. And then there's certain scenarios where I'll see an FDD and I'll right off the bat realize this is like a UFOC from the mid 90s, right? And it's just, or I'm exaggerating, but it's just not compliant. And I'll have to mention that and say, listen, like, I don't even know if these folks can legally sell you a franchise. And I've seen that. So, at the end of the day, like, those are the big picture.
Those are the big rocks kind of thing.
But getting into the details, I will give people the risks. I'll tell them, some red flags that maybe I've seen just based on a deeper dive into maybe the item 2 individuals. Maybe I'll find a bankruptcy or some litigation that isn't disclosed. But at the end of the day, it's a business decision. As long as they are going into the decision with eyes wide open.
Yep.
For me, I've done my job and helped get them to the you can lead a horse to water, right? Exactly. And so for me, it's like I've done that, and then if they decide to pursue it after understanding the risks, I'll do my best to get them into the best negotiating position as possible, and try to draft and help them with an addendum.
Yeah, I think that's like the biggest thing I talk to people about, especially when they ask, like, should I hire a franchise attorney? And what I always say is, like, you're signing this big 10-year agreement or whatever it is, right? And you got to understand what you're signing. You got to agree to the points. Like, you may not like them, but like, you need to understand and agree. And I think that's like the biggest role that, you play and all the franchise attorneys is making sure people understand, eyes wide open, like, what they're signing. If things go wrong, like, what is the worst case scenario? What's your max exposure? Yes, maybe you can negotiate it, maybe you can't, right? Every brand's different. Right. But like, it's like not knowing what you're signing and then being surprised later. That's where it's like, I think it could be a big problem for people. So
yeah, I agree with that.
I think that's the huge value. So yeah, let's get into the negotiating stuff. So like, I guess, how flexible do you see? Or is there certain, like, newer brands, you can get more mature brands. It's like, listen, sign it or don't. Like, I guess let's start about like maybe like from a spectrum of like, is age, the age of the brand a big part of it? And then like, what are the easiest ones and what are the hardest ones that you try to get for people?
Yeah, I think age is a key factor. Obviously if someone comes to me with a mature brand that everyone's heard of,
it's Subway.
Right, exactly.
It is what it is.
Right, proposing negotiating points to those brands kind of reflects on the attorney that they may not know what's going on, right? Yeah. So I know what's going on, and I would never. I tell a client straight up, like, this is going to be the deal. I'm going to help you understand your obligations, but the fact that
it is what it
want
is.
Some negotiating points, you're right. We're not going to get it. So why it'd be a wasted effort, and frankly, they may sour on you as a franchisee. As to the startup and emerging brands. Those are, I think, available, I'll say. Some will, and I'll tell the client, like, before I go into all these negotiating points, please have a conversation with your, BDC or the franchise development person working with the brand, saying, hey, are you open to a addendum negotiating? My attorney has a few points that he may want to raise with you. And I'll use that answer, right, to help guide the client on next steps. I try to stay behind the scenes. I don't like necessarily getting out in front of my clients and their ability to speak freely with the franchisor. Once the only time I'd ever get involved is if the franchisor has an attorney that I probably know from the industry that, I don't like the franchisor attorney speaking to my client.
It's a relationship of like the franchisee with the founder, or, at that level, they're probably, we're somewhat high up, and like, they're getting to know them. They're going to trust them. They're going to be part of they're going to be partners essentially. And so, yeah, probably them going still through their voice is probably better for the relationship than here's my pit bull attorney who's going to beat you up kind of thing.
Exactly.
I could see that.
And right. And for me, it's like, this is, it should be positive, right? There should be some, everything's leading towards what is going to be a long-term relationship. You don't want to necessarily sour that before the franchisee even signs.
Yep.
So for me, doing the work in the background with the risks and proposing an addendum or a bullet point list of negotiating points at minimum is something that I would either do probably through the franchisee prospect directly to the franchisor. But yeah, so the startups and the emerging brands is where I think there's some availability to negotiate an addendum. We can talk about the points that I try to hit.
Yeah, I like
but
to.
It's really dependent upon the deal, the risk factors, and trying to minimize the downside risk, and also score a few points on maybe a fee here or there.
Yep. Yeah. So what are some, like, painting a broad brush or whatever, what are some of the ones that, I'm sure you kind of have a checklist you kind of go through. What are some of the ones that you kind of prioritize?
So, I'll look at some of the provisions in the agreement that I think are not market. Like, when you start reviewing franchise agreements, you sort of see.
Yep. Yeah. You understand what's standard and what's like extreme. Okay.
Exactly. So you see kind of the basic provisions, and there are things like, liquidated damages that potentially could be negotiable.
Like,
but you kind of see those.
Do they cap it at 24, 36 months, or is it, hey, it's the life of the agreement? If it's a 15-year agreement, like, there's no cap, right? Well, it's 15 years.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah.
And so, I'll look at that. I'll look at, some of the downside risk to minimize, a potential personal liability. If this startup franchise doesn't necessarily work out as planned. So I'm looking at the downside risk on startups, that there is some risk, for example, that a brand goes into a brand new territory, right? That no one's ever heard of the brand yet, and the franchisee has to develop that market.
Yep.
Hopefully it works, right? You're hoping that for the best, but you also need to plan for if it doesn't, unfortunately. So, I'm looking for that. I'm also looking at where fees are sometimes not displayed or not, variable. Some franchise agreements don't necessarily go into the specifics of what the fee is and give the franchisor the rights to increase the fee kind of at will. So I'll look at that and kind of identify those provisions and try to at least give my client the ability to budget, the expenses in a reasonable way.
The one I've had pretty good success with over the years is they'll have like a brand fee or a tech fee, or I don't know. It's like one of the like ancillary fees, and they'll say it's currently like 1% or 2%, and we have the right to increase it to 2 or 3 or 4. Right? They're like giving themselves the right within it. And so I've had success saying, hey, you're going to cap it at whatever it currently is. So if it's at 2, we're going to keep it at 2, because there's no downside in the current day for them. And so I've had success kind of with that one. And for me, it's like, it's the same for me, but I'm also kind of protecting, this additional expense that could happen down the line. It's some of those I think or like technology fees, they'll give themselves the right to increase it by a certain amount. I think it's trying to reduce some of the potential increases there. But on the other side, like the brands, like if they have like 100 different agreements with 100 different variables, like that's really hard for them to manage too. So they probably don't want to get too many of those either. Right.
Right. Many say, hey, we would never increase it. Right. And sometimes it's interesting. I hear from clients, what franchisor sales folks are saying to them. And, it's usually very positive. And I always say, listen, you're negotiating with these people who you like. But this is a 10-year agreement. In 5 years, you may not be dealing with, Bob,
the same people, or they sell it,
right. You're dealing with
a
Rourke or some big, big company.
Yeah.
And the agreement's going to be the agreements for the next 10 years. So you may as well get anything that they've told you will happen into that addendum. And I'll also ask for like marketing pieces that sometimes contradict what is actually in the agreement as to the, uh, support, obligations, which in most franchise agreements is very minimal. I'll say,
Yep.
listen, let's incorporate some of the things that have been said to you and provided to you into that addendum to make sure that you
Interesting.
get
So you'll get screenshots of the marketing material that was used to say, hey, we're going to give you business coaching and bookkeeping support, and we got this call center that's included and this and that. And that's all then as like part of like this is your obligation, because that maybe those things aren't listed in the section that the table that says this is what we're going to give to you.
Exactly. And I treat it kind of like as like an LOI, right? You're at the discovery day, you're getting, PowerPoint presentations about all the things that are going to happen and what are said. And I want to make sure that those things are incorporated into the agreement. And usually they're not, right? Like someone,
the brands have a problem including it.
Yeah, there is obviously pushback, right? I mean, because then they'll probably speak to their lawyer and say, yeah, the lawyers, either stop saying this is going to happen because it's not in our agreement.
Or add it to the agreement. And then it's just there,
exactly,
right?
Yeah. Exactly. But, it's what I do is I use that as a prompt to say, listen, franchisee, go to the franchisor with this, say, listen, you've told me this, it's not in the agreement, how do we proceed? We can add to the addendum. And if the franchisor is not willing to do it, it's just another kind of risk factor that needs to be considered before proceeding. And that's for any negotiating point, right? I mean, I could put together a list of 15 to 20 things that, I think, the franchisee should know about, or should maybe ask the franchisor about a negotiation. But I would never present that to the franchisor because that just kind of makes the whole thing, the hogs get slaughtered or pigs get slaughtered, whatever that thing is, you don't want to go into the like George.
Yeah, there's a balance to it. I think the problem a lot of attorneys have is they're deal makers or they're deal breakers. Like,
right.
And, I know we've been on the acquisition side. We're trying to buy a franchise from somebody else. And, I've got a very good guy that we work with for all the M&A. And then sometimes the seller will have somebody and they just it's like they've never been part of a business like acquisition before. And they're like, maybe they're like their personal attorney that helps with like their will or whatever. And then they're like, it's so frustrating. And we're almost like going to walk away from a deal because we're like, I'm spending double the amount of money in legal fees to get like such a small thing done because they don't know what they're doing. And it can be really frustrating. And I could see that same thing in using an attorney when negotiating something like this. If they're arguing all these points that are like, irrelevant, it's kind of like, and then you get as the candidate or the client, right? Then you get all kind of like nervous about, well, is this like a good deal or not? Or am I like, you start to go down that road with all the fear. And so it's really understanding like what's acceptable and what's not probably. Huh?
Yeah. And it's a good point. I mean, I consider myself to be a deal maker on the franchisee side. I tell my clients, listen, these things are, what's the most important to you, right? Is there even a potential to negotiate? If there is, let's go to them with, the 5 most important things to you. Maybe we'll get 2 or 3. We'll get into an addendum. We'll get signed up, and we'll move on. And I've talked a lot about the franchisee practice. On the franchisor side, my group represents over 100 franchisor brands, and we launch brands on a monthly basis. So, I'm on the other side of it, and it's funny when I see lawyers that I know that we can get a deal done, right? Because they know the deal, they know the routine, they know the things to ask for and the things to kind of avoid. And sometimes I'll run into lawyers who don't do a lot of franchise deals on the franchisor side, and I tell my client, like, listen, like, I would just tell them no to 90% of this. We might agree to 1 or 2 things, but some of these things you would never ask for. And one of the telltale signs is if someone asks for a Word version of the franchise agreement so that they can redline it.
Oh boy!
I kind of know what I'm dealing with on the other side when I represent my clients.
Yeah, that's a good one. That's a good one. Let me just cross out 30% of it, send it back.
Right.
What are so yeah, I want to get into the franchise owner in a second here, but what are some big like red flags that you've seen in agreements, or maybe that you didn't see in agreements that should have been in? Is it like the bankruptcy stuff where like the founders had other businesses that failed, they didn't disclose? Like what are some of the things that you've seen over the years?
Yeah, so I focus on items 2, which is the people. I'll look into
the
their
leadership
background, right, their leadership,
Yep.
and look into their background. And I like to see people that have some prior franchise experience, or that have, owners that have developed this concept for forever, and they've teamed up with someone in the franchise
Yep.
industry that kind of knows the ins and outs of supporting franchisees, those sort of things. Item 3, obviously litigation. You don't want to see any in the early stages of a franchise company, especially franchisor disputes. There are some things that pop up in item 3 that I can kind of advise my clients that it's not necessarily something that is problematic.
Yeah, some of them are problems. Some of them and I've seen, like, not to mention, it was a certain tax brand, and they had like 73 lawsuits in there of them suing franchisees. And it was like, they basically get it. Anybody could get in almost for free. Hey, we'll sell their finance or whatever. We'll finance the whole thing. Oh, your business doesn't work. Oh, now we're going to sue you for like the fee plus royalties for X amount of years. And it was like 17 pages of lawsuits and crazy. Like that's their model. Like, and it's a shame. And then there's other ones you read and it's like, well, a franchisee, like this happens in my brain. Midas has happened where people like closed it down but they kept operating as Midas, which it wasn't, or they like, they're basically, operating the brand without being a franchisee, which is a problem. So.
Yeah. And, you don't want to see that at all. It may kind of push to the forefront an underlying issue between franchisees and franchisors, but there are certainly, in my representation of franchisors, like, have I had to go to the mattresses with the franchisee for, taking confidential information, trade secrets, using the brand or a confusingly similar brand name? Yes, I have. So it's like, I get it. And I'm able to tell my clients, like, listen, as long as you toe the line and comply and you're meeting your obligations, this won't happen to you. But just know that the franchisor is not shy about going after folks that are non-compliant. And frankly, it does protect your interests in being a franchisee if the franchisor is protecting its brand and making sure people aren't signing up and then stealing the information.
Even as an operator, Midas, like I want them to, like there's a whole campaign called the detractors, who were like all the people who are detracting from the brand. And it was a very intentional process for, the corporate people to go to those people and say, hey, like, it looks like you don't want to be part of it. Either you need to like get to the level of standard that we expect, or you need to get out of the system. And, they had ways they try to, incentivize the good performers like me to buy them out with like different things. And so, cause they didn't want to go the legal route, but it hurts everybody, especially the good guys, for the ones that aren't performing and hurting the brand, bad Google reviews. They look like crap, like whatever it is, and all of it. So, then on the franchisor side, how many, you said you have about 100 or so you represent?
Yeah, we do. We work with some of the best franchise development companies out there as legal counsel, and assist with FTD drafting and state registrations, things like that. So that's where a lot of our startups come from. I certainly work with people that are interested in just expanding their brand through franchising. They have the kind of the internal capacity and corporate manpower to be able to do it without necessarily the need of a franchise development consultant, with just our guidance on the legal side. And certainly I've been around the block enough and have developed brands in, frankly, every industry imaginable, and some that you would never even think could ever be franchised at all. But at the end of the day, I'm able to, advise on kind of the business side of most concepts, considering, our experience in most industries.
Okay. So you're working, So you're helping draft the initial FDD, and then helping, do you like are you part of kind of some of those negotiations with the franchisees of those? Like, do you represent them?
Oh yeah, yeah. So I mean, that's part of our franchisor practice. That's like the startup, I'd say the startup wing. We represent emerging brands of anywhere from, 1 unit to 300 units is probably our sweet spot. Where we're sort of maybe the first counsel and lead the client all the way up to the point where they're looking to start on taking on some serious investment, private equity. And I just had a call 5 minutes before this started with a client who wants to strategize for private equity investment, and we launched them in 2015. And so they're, Florida-based brand that has grown and expects to have about 100 units open by the end of next year. And they're looking at, potential strategic buyers or private equity investors and getting a valuation on the business. So, the goal for me, is to be there at the beginning, right? And then kind of assist the client and make sure they stay compliant, get all their docs in one spot, ready for that private equity investor or the investor down the road that is interested in looking under the hood, and they can see that from start to finish, or start to that point, everything has been done by the books, and they're prepared to, start negotiating a deal.
Yeah, that's awesome. What are your thoughts around an item 19? Like, there's a lot of controversy where people like, if they don't have them, is it a big red flag? If they do, sometimes the stuff you see in there is kind of a joke, and you can tell it's like been super scrubbed and like, but then people like put a bunch of value on this thing and says it's like, adjusted net profit. And it's like, they have like 4 expense lines in there. It's like, it's not really net profit. So I don't know, what are your thoughts just around both constructing it? Cause like you represent people who construct it. Right. And then also like the viewing of it. And obviously there's a huge giant grain of salt that you're looking at it with. So like, I don't know, what's your perspective on just that whole chapter?
Sure. And I look at it from both sides, from jumping back to the items that I'm looking for for the franchisee clients that are looking to invest. Item 19 is certainly one of the main ones, right? We talk about item 2, item 3, item 4 also with the bankruptcy situation. Sometimes those are not included, and I like to find information about that. I do a little deeper dive into that. But then, jumping up to item 19, I'm looking at the number of units that are being portrayed. It's funny. Some of the biggest brands started with 1, right? And looking at, for example, I think it was Restore, which is a pretty big health and wellness company that just got a good amount of private equity money. I think maybe last year. Looking at their first FTD, they had 1 location and 1 P&L that was listed in there, and it wasn't even spectacular, but it did have an honest assessment of their 1 unit, both top line and bottom line, and gave the franchisee the ability to make a decision on whether or not to pursue it. Sometimes when franchisors get a little bit cute and try to overstate and oversell what they've actually got, I'll be able to see that, and of course I advise my clients on the franchisor side to, just be as straightforward as possible, give as much data as you can, and try not to use it too much as a puff piece, right? Because if those numbers, are either deemed to be incorrect or, it's not necessarily giving the franchisee a true and accurate portrayal of what a franchise unit can do, I mean, you could end up with some problems. So I'm all about more data, the better, and putting it in a way that is, straightforward, easy to understand, and gives the franchise prospect the idea of what top line, what bottom line has historically been achieved by either the corporate unit or the franchise unit. So we're both.
Yeah, I think it's funny as a franchisee is like, my goal in creating a financial statement is to show as little money as possible, right? Because I don't want to pay that much in taxes. But then the franchisor wants franchisees to submit P&Ls, and they want to show as much money as possible, right? To sell more franchises, and it's probably more accurate, right? And so it's always a challenge. We've had this big challenge, at least in our brand and other brands, of like them like wanting access to P&Ls, and then they have to go through it, and then it's like they have to scrub it to see like, well, what's accurate, what's personal expenses, what's your your wife's on salary and this and that, right? So it's kind of funny. There is this like they have opposite agendas of what they want to do when they submit it. So obviously from a corporate location, they can run it totally clean and it's super easy. So obviously if they got a corporate location to show a P&L, and then they've got franchisees to show sales data, that's probably like or maybe gross margin, something that's like really easy to kind of capture. But as much as we'd all love to see P&Ls, like a lot of franchisees don't. It's against like what they want, and then it just becomes a ton of work. So, I think that's interesting.
And that's always a challenge at renewal time. Especially with brands that we represent that have a good number of units, right? It's getting that data, making sure that you have a good percentage of franchisee data. And I know there are some softwares out there that are coming online. My good friend, the Wolf of Franchises, and Crockett is just a quick, not to plug them or anything, but those types of softwares can be utilized by franchisors and should be utilized early on to get franchisees in the mindset of, hey, the franchisor is allowed to get this data, under the agreement. We need to make sure that the data that we provide is accurate, correct, and using a software early on really, I think, would benefit most brands to be able to put forth the best item 19 years down the road.
Yep, that's awesome. Cool. I appreciate you coming on and kind of sharing all your kind of wisdom and knowledge in the franchise space. If someone's interested in getting contact with you, what is the best way to do that?
Great question. I recently launched a new firm. Very excited about it. It's called The Franchise Firm. You can find us at thefranchisefirm.com. My email is adam@thefranchisefirm.com. And you can find me on Twitter. I try to keep my DMs open. I am at Adam G. Wasch, ESQ. And usually if you DM me, I'll respond quickly. And, I love talking to people, educating people on the industry, and helping out where needed.
Awesome. Cool. Thanks again for coming on. And it was great catching up.
Yeah. Thanks, Brian. Appreciate it.